Good afternoon, members. I call Committee of the Whole on Bill 20, Clause 1 to order. We are on Clause 1, Shall Clause 1. Member from Langley, Walnut Grove.
Perfect, thank you. Actually, sorry, we adjourned mid-response. So,
I assume the AG has memorized exactly the words that he was saying at the time.
sorry, yes, we adjourned mid-response, so that's why
Minister?
Thanks to member for reminding me. I owed an answer. So just to talk through the three definitions that I think were raised: notice of adjudication, notice of non-payment, and proper invoice in terms of how they're set out in the definition section. So first of all, the reason that they are noted here in definitions with just a simple reference to the section is because it's kind of like as the term that I think they use is like a signpost for readers, that when you're looking for this, refer to that section. So just for clarity and ease of putting it together, there's no material difference in that method or use of that. And then when you go to between those three definitions, if you go to the section, it will talk about what, and all of these are very detailed things, and they're very kind of pivotal to the process of prompt payment. So when you go to the sections referred to, it lays out exactly what is meant by a notice of non-payment, for example.
Member from Langley, Walnut Grove.
thank you. I did, when I was reading my notes again last night, and then I was just going through these two items, I realized that I did make an error in that notice of adjudication definitely had kind of more requirements on what a notice would look like: names, address of parties, et cetera, et cetera. But it was more the notice of non-payment that was a little bit more vague, in the sense that it says specifies the amount and reasons for non-payment, but it doesn't talk about what is actually required in terms of a written notice, name of company, things like that, whereas other parts of the bill are very specific as to the exact information required on a notice. So if the minister could just go back to more specifically notice of non-payment.
Minister?
Thanks. So it's kind of a balance in terms of how the team looked at it, comparing other legislation with how much to write within the definition or in the section it refers to, as being like clearly required, and how much to leave to more industry with the idea that you could have a regulation if you needed to. So anytime it says prescribed, gives you the ability to prescribe a actually standard form. So I think the comparison that the member's asking about proper invoices, so proper invoices really lays out everything that you definitely need in that proper invoice, because it's such kind of a pivotal thing in the whole structure of the prompt payment regime. And then for notice of non-payment, it says some clear things, right? You need to specify certain things in your notice of non-payment, and some clear, the clear timelines, and it also gives the ability to have by regulation, a prescribed form. So we can work with industry and understand how it's going and set up a regulation that if needed, like puts the more clarity in exactly what is needed for a notice of non-payment. So that was the kind of balancing act that was.
Member from Langley Walnut Grove.
Thank you. Just switching gears a little bit. I really took a lot of time trying to understand two of the definitions in terms of the intent versus the interpretation of them. And most notably, it's the definition of owner and the definition of person. Sorry. Yeah, a person. And understanding where the definition could hold, I think, sorry, I'll backpedal a little bit here. A lot of the initial reaction to this bill was whether government and crown corporations were going to be exempted or possibly exempted from this legislation. And part of me was really honing in on the term owner, and then within the definition of owner, the definition of person, and seeing how that could be strengthened by including government or crown. Now that I've kind of digested what I've learned, I just want to put on public record in regards to the Interpretation Act for persons, and then also owner, that government entities and also crown is encapsulated as an owner and as or alternatively a person. And if the minister could just please rise for the record just to clarify how that is to be interpreted so that we have it on record. Thank you.
Minister?
Okay, so just maybe I'll give a broad enough answer that covers different sections of the act, but also ties into this conversation. So first of all, with respect to the specific question about that definition, person is inclusive of many things, but also would include government entities. And then owner is defined to be like a very functional definition to interact with what that person is doing. So who retains a contract to supply services. So it's very broad in the sense of its application. And just to make it clearer, the Interpretation Act, as the member brings up, it contains all the definitions that sometimes you don't have to redefine in an act. But when we get to section 47.2, which is coming up, what you'll see in there is, because we wanted to make it clear that this act applies to public and private entities, like that it just applies to all projects, you'll see that section 47.2 specifically exempts a section of the Interpretation Act that is for a government exemption. So we specifically put it in there to make sure that it was clear that this is broad enough to apply to all.
Member from Langley Walnut Grove.
Thank you for clarifying that. Is there any instance in which, because this, in my understanding, does include government, but is there anything within the definition or the Interpretation Act where the government or Crown would be or could be, not necessarily that it is, exempt? Does the minister have that ability to exempt a project or an owner?
Minister?
Thanks. So just in the interest of moving through the legislation, I am really happy to get to the clauses related to applicability. They're coming, and then we can get into a deep conversation of further down clauses. But I can tell you that the definitions right now, just like you'll see in other parts of the Act, are making it clear that, which is what we heard from all of our roundtable and all of our work that the team did to dig into it. The broadest application of this, including public and private, is the way that you get at solving prompt payment across the whole sector, because all these companies are interchangeable, right? They do projects across the board. And you'll see that in different sections, and I'm happy to revisit that about how it shows that it's so broad.
Member from Kelowna Mission.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to the Attorney General for that clarity around the inclusion of government. Recognizing that we may ultimately revisit this significantly later in Section 51, but since we're simply on the topic, I would just like to get a little bit of clarity as to whether the intent to include government is whether there is any intent for the inclusion of government to be subject to phased implementation. Again, I recognize we'll likely revisit this in 51, but I do just want to get to the question since we're just in it now momentarily.
Minister?
No, and it goes into what I was saying before. What we heard from the sector, and the point of it is to apply to as broad a range like of the whole sector, so we can get at the issue, which is making sure prompt payments happen.
Member from Kelowna Mission.
Thank you. Appreciate the answer. I'll go back to definitions, and again, I may explore this particular definition a little further under subsequent sections, but just to lay the frame for that, when it comes to the definition of contractor, is the intent of the legislation for contractor to mean a person or a corporate person, or is the intent for that to mean a consolidated corporate person? For example, in the case of a holdco, opco, or joint venture structure.
Minister?
Yes, it's broad enough to include what entities like the member is referring to.
Member from Kelowna Mission.
Thank you very much. I may come back to that in more detail at a subsequent time as we're into sections where that becomes relevant, but I appreciate that initial groundwork. There are a few items that, as I read through the bill, there are terms that are not defined, and I am just curious to understand if there is a reason they are not defined. So expect a series of questions related to a couple of items. Could the Attorney General clarify why the term prescribed information, which is used repeatedly, is not defined?
Minister?
The term prescribed is found in the Interpretation Act with already a definition.
Member from Kelowna Mission.
Thank you. For the sake of convenience, could the Attorney General provide that definition?
Minister?
It means, and this is the whole thing, prescribed by regulation.
Member from Kelowna Mission.
Thank you. Similar question around prescribed interest rate. I assume that, again, the assumption is that that will be defined by regulation, but as that could become quite material at a commercial level to folks that are affected by this legislation, could the Attorney General provide any initial indications as to how government intends to set about defining the prescribed interest rate?
Minister.
Yeah, thank you. So in setting the rate, I think the balance that you wanna find is to have it to be sufficient enough to incentivize changes of behavior, but not overly onerous on the industry. So we will, as we did just to make this bill, be guided by, we've already committed to consulting with industry related to that. Another guidepost will be what other provinces are doing when they have similar legislation and they've set a prescribed interest rate, just to see where it's sitting. But this will be one of those points that we'll have a good conversation with the industry before we put the regulations in place to find that spot of incentive to change behavior, but not overly onerous.
Member from Kelowna Mission.
Thank you. And is there any early indications as to whether the intent is for that to be a fixed interest rate or a dynamic interest rate?
Minister.
Yeah, so because it's so important to talk to industry about this, I don't want to, we haven't come to the realization in a kind of a prejudgment way where we have something in mind. So just had an interesting discussion about what other jurisdictions do related to that. And I think it's kind of variable, so it could be fixed or variable. I think it's something that we would just like depend on our conversations.
Member from Kelowna Mission.
Solid answer and appreciated. I think certainly I appreciate hearing that that will be developed in consultation with industry and that it will be suitably refined to try to match market conditions. So I certainly appreciate the answer. Another term that I see used but not defined is the term ratably and rateable. I would assume that that references to some level of pro rata payment, but I don't see it defined anywhere, and it is a rather obscure term. So I'm hoping that I can get some clarity on the intended meaning of that.
Minister.
All right, thanks for the question. So just we'll start by the general way that drafters look at when they define or when they don't, because maybe it'll help with the conversation. So first of all, as a little anecdote from the drafting team that I just heard about is that everything is defined, right? It's defined in a dictionary. So we don't start by saying we have to define everything. What we think is like when we're doing drafting, when you choose something to define, is it because it has a special meaning in accordance with the act? Or is it just the ordinary meaning of the word? Meaning you could look it up in a dictionary and it means something and everybody can understand that. So with the words that the member raised with rateably and rateable, that is, those are words that are just their ordinary meaning and essentially mean proportionality, right? That there's some kind of proportional analysis related to it. And those are follow the wording that's used in Ontario's statute. So in the matter of like the judgment of the drafters, it wasn't a word that needed a special definition because you would just think of it as the ordinary meaning of the word.
Member from Kelowna Mission.
In the context of the bill, what is the ordinary meaning of the word rateable?
Minister.
You could think of it as like proportional, like you could use those interchangeably.
Member from Langley Walnut Grove.
Thank you. One of the trends that I noticed while being on the job site and managing projects before I got elected was a trend, and something that we shouldn't be surprised of is that how technology is starting to be incorporated into building projects, whether it's software or proprietary buildings systems and things like that. So when I look at the definition of a contractor or a subcontractor, it specifically means a person who supplies services or materials. So if I look at the definition of services, it has the same meaning of the Builders Lien Act. If I go into the Builders Lien Act, it refers to services as an architect or an engineer, or also in terms of rental of equipment, etc. If I then flip to the bill's definition of materials, it refers specifically to movable property. Now, in the case of technology or proprietary technologies and softwares that one might contract for a specific building project, we do have a gap in terms of that definition. And it is something that is emerging on the scene, on the ground, and is not being covered by these definitions. And I was wondering if the Attorney General could go into whether she agrees that there's a gap or where she would see technology being used and being contracted as being covered in this bill.
Minister?
Okay, thanks. So just to start by what I think the definition of an inclusive definition, which is a funny way of saying it, but like when a definition is inclusive, and that's kind of like gives a legal sentiment of it doesn't list things to the exclusion of others, right? It gives examples of what's included in, for example, in this case, services, and is broadly kind of meant to capture a certain category of things. So the intention, and I appreciate the question because it gives me the opportunity to clarify it for the future use of this bill, is the intention of all of these definitions is to be inclusive and include things like the member brought up, which is technology. And I think that's a really interesting form of where construction is going, right? Like there's a whole bunch more innovative and different uses of technology that support the construction sector, front end, back end, but also in making the actual buildings of the project. So we think the definition is, we know the definition is broad enough, but like, I guess what I'll say is that we talked to JEDI also, the ministry there, when we were doing this, just to make sure we were capturing and anything in here was capturing the kind of new and innovative things that were happening in the construction sector that, of course, technology is part of all of our lives now, but that we want to make it clear that if it's something that was a service that was attached to this construction project, if you think of it that way, then it's included in the prompt payment. And the kind of fail-safe that we have, if we feel like all of the broad definitions that we've applied to this, which we think capture everything, but let's say there's a situation 5 years from now where we feel like something's being missed or something's trying to carve themselves out of prompt payment wrongfully, then we have a regulatory power under 49 that allows us to clarify that a certain I don't know what it would be, who knows, is included in the definition or included in this regime.
Member from Langley Walnut Grove.
Thank you. So on this side, we don't like a lot of interpretation being left to regulation. And I think in this case, I would argue that it's actually pretty prescriptive. It's not broad. When I look at the definition of services, it says as an architect or engineer or rental of equipment. It's very prescriptive. It's not broad, saying and other items, etc. Same with materials. It only refers to movable property. It's not inclusive of other types of materials. So for those reasons, I'd actually like to table an amendment. Did I say that right?
We'll be taking a 5-minute recess to make copies of the amendment. We'll call the committee back. Members, we have an amendment to clause 1. And I will look to the member from Langley Walnut Grove for comments.
Yeah, so this is important, especially with how the industry and all industries are moving, which is to more technology-based processes. We will never be rid of labor and physical materials in construction, but we are definitely being filled in with new technologies and softwares, and I think it's really important that anything we do now moving forward in legislation and captures that, and not relying on items like the Builders Lien Acts, which is older. This is a great opportunity, especially when it specifically pertains to the construction industry, that we capture technology as a type of service and/or materials.
Minister?
Okay, appreciate where the amendment is coming from, but I can't support it, and I just want to, in doing so, make it clear why it would potentially do, I think, with the opposite of what the member's intending. So just to say, I'll start from the beginning about what an inclusive definition is. The reason it's an inclusive definition of services is it is meant to be broad in the sense of what services is, and when you read it to know that this is not an exclusive list. And the broadness of the definition helps to keep it as a sentiment that's well understood by people to be a broad term. So that's an important starting point about what an inclusive definition does. And then I just want to go back to the two things in there. It says services and materials. So the way you would legally look at that is materials are movable. So anything that is on part of a construction project that you move is a material. Services are, of course, not, right? They're any service related to a construction project. So those two broad definitions are broad enough to capture everything involved in a construction project. And then just to say, one of the things that we know with the deep work that the teams did is that since 2019 in Ontario, when they passed it, they had a similar broad definition of service. And when we talked and saw their review and talked to our industry partners, nobody raised this as an issue. And I think the reason is because it's generally understood that technology is included in services, and it's part of our life and part of every industry right now. So it hasn't actually showed up as an issue. So even all the industry partners that looked at our draft copies of the bill understood services to include that. So we're also not solving that problem, but we actually could be doing harm because by adding technology, so you have your two things, right? You have services and materials, which are broad enough to cover movable, not movable, those kind of things, the broad definitions. If you add technology, it actually weakens the definition of services because legally interpreted, you might say, why did they single out technology as not being included of services? And then you run the risk of having a lot of unforeseeable issues arise out of that one change. And also the risk of not being able to keep up with where the industry is going and whatever direction it is that might be included in services in the future, because the complaint then could be in the future, why didn't they specifically list that? And if they didn't specifically list it, and it's not included in services, and it doesn't apply to me. So the construction of this is to keep it as broad as possible. So just to, hopefully that clarifies why we won't be supporting this amendment and why the member can be assured that yes, technology is included in the definition of services, and we would expect that is how it would play out. And the reason we know that's how it's going to play out is because we can see what happened in Ontario with a similar broad definition that did have that as part of the prompt payment regime.
Okay. On the amendment, the question is the amendment to clause 1. Shall the amendment pass? Oh, sorry, all those in favor? Aye. All those opposed?
Nay. On division.
On division. The amendment is defeated on division. Shall Clause 1, member from Kelowna Mission. Shall Clause 1 pass? Aye. So ordered. Shall Clause 2 pass? Aye. Member from Kelowna Mission.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I flagged previously that I would be returning to the question of complex contractor structures in the definitions. And I just want to canvass that a little bit because I want to understand whether a certain issue has been thought through and how it will be dealt with. So the reason why I asked about contractor structures and whether a contractor is defined solely as a company or as, for example, a group of companies, is to understand what the implications of this particular approach would be. To use a very simple example, in the case of a holdco-opco structure. So when we're talking about contract position, let's envision a scenario where there is a company who is, let's call it the master company in this instance, who has a contract with an owner or who has a contract with a contractor that is further up the chain. Now let's say, for the sake of argument, and this would not be an unusual structure, that this master company has a sub-entity, a subordinate entity, that is actually the operating company that is doing the work in this instance. So in that case, from a strict definitional perspective, we would actually be talking about two companies, two contractors who hold two positions in the chain of contracts. And as such, there could be some uncertainty as to whether a given consolidated entity that actually consists of two or even more entities could actually, again, technically occupy two or even three positions within this question of contract position. And as such, that could actually elongate the eligible time frame for payment, such that instead of being 7 days, it was 14 days, and again, that could have knock-on implications down the chain, particularly in the case of complex projects and complex organizational structures. So I just wanted to understand whether that had been considered and or taken into account in the development of the approach.
Minister.
Okay, so I think at the heart of the question is about the complexity that exists in the construction sector related to wholly owned companies and subsidiaries and all the subcontracting that might actually exist with companies. So I think it helps to explain this by breaking it down to how we constructed this bill. So in this particular section, it says who is the owner is 0, right? And then the position of the contractor is 1. And then it goes down from there for subcontractors. So to the member's question, yes, it may be that different organizations on that pyramid of that chain of contracts may be related in some other way, right? And he raised an example of it that may be true, that they're related another way. But when we look at the need for prompt payment, it's triggered by the owner and the contractor. So if a proper invoice was delivered, whoever it was on that chain or whatever related corporate structures they have, that's the trigger of who's 0, which is the owner, and that contractor is 1. And then it goes down from there for subcontractors. So you really have to pin it on so if you look at it, who asked for a service and who delivered the service, or who's asking to be paid for that service, right? So the owner has a service and a contract, the person delivered it, they want to be paid on time, they issue the proper invoice, it triggers the 0, 1, 2 down that cycle. So yeah, there may be tons of relationships at play, but that's the way you simplify it, by making sure the proper invoice triggers the right people down the chain that need to pay.
Member from Kelowna Mission.
Thank you. I appreciate the explanation, and I think it's a good faith explanation. I do want to delve into this question a little bit more, because I actually think there are some complexities here that need to be addressed. So I will paint a hypothetical situation. This is obviously just a situation to explain what the point I'm trying to make. If the owner is Dues Bridge Builders, and there is then a contractor who is Sharma's General Contracting, hypothetically, and Sharma's General Contracting is part of the Sharma Group. The Sharma Group is a consolidated entity that does major infrastructure works. Now, either as a result of existing corporate structure or as a result of an effort to delay payment and to keep cash flow and liquidity within the controlled group, there could be a scenario where, hypothetically, Sharma's General Contracting actually breaks the value chain up into a series of entities. And there could be Sharma's Contracting 1, which is then subcontracting to Sharma's Contracting 2, down to Sharma's Contracting 3, and we don't need to define all the various different nuts and bolts and things they could be doing in this hypothetical example, and all the way after we make our way through 4 layers of Sharma's Contracting, sitting at the bottom of that is poor little Van Popta Contracting. And Van Popta Contracting is all the way down that chain and is now actually sitting on the potential for substantial delay because of the structure of Sharma Contracting, whether, again, that structure is just a normal run-of-course situation in industry, or whether there is a malign actor who has decided to structure their affairs in such a way that they're able to functionally marinate invoices for longer than would otherwise be possible. So what I'm trying to understand is whether and how the bill contemplates consolidated entities, contemplates contemplates effectively owned subcontractors within that chain of contracts, and how those could have unintended consequences or could create market aberrations where, for example, you could be looking at 2 parallel chains of contracts where the chain of contracts between the owner and Van Popta contractors in this situation could either put them in position 2 or position 5, depending on what the structure is. And that in itself could then have significant implications for the payment timeline for that subsequent subcontractor further down the chain. So again, I'm painting a fairly stark and oversimplified example of how that might work, but I'm just trying to understand how that would be approached from a regulatory perspective or from a real world perspective. Thank you.
Minister?
Yeah, I just want to thank the member for providing this example because it really helps me to walk through to people listening about the power of this bill. Exactly for our poor Van Popta company that's at the bottom of this chain. And as described, unfortunately, by Sharma companies, is at the hands of very shady practices, essentially. So let's start with, I think, is one of the really powerful provisions is Section 47, which we will get to at some point, that really talks about the fact that if there is such a regime that's set up, that is purposefully, sounds like being set up in the description that was provided to me, to circumvent this regime, then they're running the risk of all of the contracts just being void, so their whole structure being void. So I think that's one of the clearest tools. But also, just if we think about poor Van Popta at the bottom of that chain, that company now has way more remedies and dispute than they would ever have if this bill was to be enforced. So we'll just start with the timelines and the remedies available to that company. So first of all, the right to information. There's way more right to information now about the contractors and their chain and what the proper invoice was under this act. And they're entitled to know basically about a lot of things they were maybe not entitled to know about or didn't have a way to access. And so it's going to be very hard for the Sharma groups to hide what they're doing based on that. And that, of course, leaves them open to the Section 47 that I just mentioned. And also, if we think about that chain, that's exactly, so timelines, for payment and also dispute resolution is the next one. So what would happen most likely by the Van Popta of this scheme, that they would have to either figure out how they're going to hire a lawyer, go to court, enforce their payments, all those things that were a high barrier, especially if you're at the maybe bottom of that chain or aren't as liquid in your assets and your team as some of the bigger companies, would be kind of an impenetrable barrier to actually figuring out how you collect. So with this bill, that company would have a remedy in a resolution to get payment in a quicker way. So those are just some of the ways that the bill would be structured. Just to say that I think one of the reasons that all of the sectors came to us to ask for these kind of things was to not only make prompt payment and all the things we talked about at the beginning go smoothly, but if there are bad actors, that it actually does shine a light and give remedy to them in a way that doesn't exist now.
Member from Kelowna Mission.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the explanation from the Attorney General, and I want to be clear that I in no way, shape, or form intend to impugn any Sharma in my example. The Attorney General merely was sitting across from me, and I had to come up with a fake name quickly. So I want to make that totally clear and appreciate the thoughtful answer. I had, in fact, circled Section 47, so I appreciate that being raised in terms of the broad scope of remedies. And if you'll allow me to be just a tiny bit pedantic in terms of this particular section, we have talked about remedies which I think primarily would be tools to be used after the fact if there has been malfeasance or abuse of the system. I think the Attorney General summarized a number of those remedies, and that was certainly appreciated. Up front, particularly in the early days of establishing and normalizing kind of the regime of prompt payment, the expectations, kind of socializing this with industry, how will the government enforce the calculation of contract position in complex chains of subcontractors to ensure prompt payment cascades correctly? And alongside that enforcement, what are the intentions around communicating and making information available to allow good actors who are simply trying to understand how they should be engaging with this regime? So again, we talked about a hypothetical company, the Sharma Group, that in this instance was engaging in manipulation of the system. There could easily be another group, the Nikki Group, that is a good actor who simply has a standard OpCo, HoldCo situation and is just wanting to understand whether that means they've got 7 days or 14. So can I just get a little bit more explanation around what the broad intentions are on explaining and socializing the approach to industry?
Minister?
Thank you. So there was two questions there that the member asked, and I'll talk through both of them. So the first one is, which is I think a point that we have heard from the industry, is that there's different levels of sophistication and/or staff teams related in the construction chain. So making sure that everybody understands what these rules are and how they apply to them is like very important. So there's a couple of things that we did to take that concern that we heard into account, and one is delayed implementation. So it'll be brought, we have regulations to work through, as we've mentioned, that we'll work through with industry, but also the time period before it comes into force gives us that proper time to get out there and make sure people understand how invoicing needs to change, if they, all those kind of things that are part of it. I just want to give a shout out to BCCA. They've already started with this education of the sector, so they have a question and answer that's already online for people to understand what the new rules are. Just to say that this was something that was is done for industry, requested by industry. So it's about setting clear rules and timelines out there. It's not about government oversight, besides setting up like this process and letting it act in the world as it should. So as a result of that, to the second question about how to enforce calculations, it will be, of course, driven by industry, but we think we have the right tools in there to have that happen. So for example, if you feel like, if you're somewhere on there on the chain and you feel like something's wrong in that proper invoice, or there's a calculation that's wrong, or somebody's mistreating you somehow, or you can pull out and do a quick notice of adjudication quickly. So like a fast-tracked thing to get right in there and sort that out, is one of the tools that are there to kind of intervene at those times that when it may be needed.
Member from Kelowna Mission.
Thank you. I appreciate the great explanation. That's very helpful. And certainly I'm, in my conversation with the industry, it's clear there has been a lot of good conversation and a lot of good thought around this. The questions I'm asking are intended at the margin, just to understand whether there are any residual issues that are not clear, any residual implications that could become complex. I think this is probably a fairly simple question. And it's been partially covered by the Attorney General's previous answer. But has the ministry assessed and quantified the administrative burden this new hierarchy system may create for small firms or sole proprietors who are unfamiliar with legal numbering systems and other complexities that are introduced here?
Recognizing the Attorney General.
Yes, as I think I mentioned earlier, that was the concern that we heard from some of the discussions. Not that it isn't good to do this, it's just that we need to be cognizant of the different levels in the construction chain that might be impacted, that may not have, like as I mentioned earlier, the same level of legal team and all those other resources. So just to say that what we've seen when we followed what happened in Ontario, and that roundtable really dug into it, is that there was a short-term adjustment period that people needed to do, and they did it. And then since then, it's had the desired effect of actually making it better for those people that are maybe the group that can't hire the 10 lawyers to go after their payment, because it gives them faster access to a cheaper remedy. So the net result after that adjustment period is positive for everybody.
Recognizing the member from Langley Walnut Grove.
Thank you. Welcome to the chair. In some of my experience, especially at the early stages of a project, you can quite often have the owner directly contract with a subcontractor. So somebody who by definition would be considered a subcontractor. Could the Attorney General please clarify if they would be renamed as a contractor and treated as position one? Or how would that work if a subcontractor is being hired directly by an owner, which is position 0?
Minister.
Thank you. So I think in the example provided, the contractor would be the contractor for the purposes of the act. So if we take it back to the service or materials that's under that contract, an owner might have like many different contracts with many different either service providers or material providers in a group. So you take a look at that particular contract for that material or service, that would be the trigger. So then the owner's 0 and then that contractor is 1. And if that contractor subcontracts, then they would be the next in line. You wouldn't have to reshift any of that chain of command. We would start with that contract, right? The initial contract, and that the owner and the contractor would be set out like that way.
Shall Clause 2 pass? Aye. So ordered. On Clause 3, member.
Thank you. So clause 3 is one of the clauses that refers subject to regulations. So I was wondering if the minister, for the record here, could talk about who could be designated as a substitute owner in this case, and what accountability measures ensure that the substitute meets all owner obligations under this act.
Minister.
So this provision is intended to kind of respect what happens in a lot of scenarios in the sector where you may be the owner, but you hire somebody like a project manager or somebody else to conduct the construction project that you're undertaking. So in that sense, it allows that to cover for scenarios like that. And we also have the regulation making ability to put kind of, if we see, and I think we had this conversation earlier about if somebody's misusing some of these things to get around payment, then we have regulatory making power to put more parameters around that.
Member.
What about substitute subcontractors? Quite often, you might have a contractor not be able to meet obligations or to be substituted in. Could the minister please, or the attorney general please, describe how this legislation would work in that regard?
Minister.
Okay, so the reason that the bill is structured to make it clear who the owner is and whether or not there's like this idea of this substitute owner is because the owner is pivotal to the whole chain. So you need to know who the owner is because they're the one that's responsible for that prompt payment to the services. So that's the focus that it has on clarity for the owner's sake. Now, in scenarios down the chain, when it comes to contractors, subcontractors, and how that might unroll and the different setups that might occur in, then you would have to go back to the contract. So you go back to the contract and of materials and services and what that proper invoice included. If that proper invoice included that service, then the owner's 0, this contractor's 1, and then it goes down the subcontractor chain. So everything that flows through that contract for delivery contracts or whatever for the delivery of that service would be captured, and then you would go down the chain that way.
Members of the committee, I will ask that when the minister or the member is speaking, that you not be speaking. The rest of the time, quiet conversation is fine, but, oh, all right, and we are apparently going to take a recess for 10 minutes. Well done, Bruce. Bringing the committee back to order, we are on Clause 3 of the Construction Prompt Payment Act, Bill 20, recognizing, shall Clause 3 pass? Aye. So ordered. On Clause 4, member?
Thank you. Clause 4 would be something that I would like to hear the Attorney General kind of describe a bit better or explain a bit better. It sounds a little bit circulative in the sense that it says subject to subsection 2, that this act applies in relation to the supply of services and materials for an improvement under contract, but then subsection 2 says that this act does not apply in relation to a prescribed improvement contract, service, or material. So just to clarify the intent of this particular clause and the application of it.
Minister.
Yeah, thank you. So this type of provision is in line with the work that we did that was cross-jurisdictional, that had this idea of this ability to have some flexibility in what it may apply to or not. And the reason behind that is, although I'm not sure it's been used in other jurisdictions, there may be a compelling reason why you would want, like, let's say there was an emergency situation with a natural disaster or something where there needed to be a rebuild or something that was very quick. That could be a scenario. Or I know that some organizations like UDI, and we've not made any decisions on this, are making the case that some really small home renovations, so if you're getting your kitchen redone or something under a certain amount, or small contractors, that there may be a reason that government at some point, if this bill was in place, might want to say, okay, we don't need to apply these rules to that level of contract. So it just gives the flexibility, although, as we mentioned before, everything we've heard about how these have worked in other jurisdictions and how we intend it to is that you need to apply it to the broadest base of the construction sector to make sure that it's effective for all contractors and subcontractors and workers that are in the sector.
Member.
So this section specifically doesn't say subject to regulations. So I'm just trying to understand what exemptions or how that process would be determined, what kind of exemptions there could be for a prescribed improvement contract or service or materials. So what would that criteria for exemption look, and how transparent will this process be to ensure it does not undermine the Act's intent?
Minister.
So the reason you know it's by regulation is the word prescribed is in there, and I think we mentioned earlier in our definition section that prescribed is defined in the Interpretation Act as prescribed by regulation. So that's the reason that you see that it's triggered. And I guess to the second part of the question, we have endeavored and committed to industry that in making the regulations moving forward, we would sit down with them and talk through things like we talked about before about the rate, the interest rate, and how that would apply in other applications. And I can say that the policy goal of this government, although every government will have decision-making authority in the future, is to have this applied to the broadest spectrum possible in order to get the changes that we want to see in the industry.
Member.
Could the Attorney General explain if, in her opinion, could exempting specific categories of work result in subcontractors being left out with prompt payment protections this Act is meant to guarantee? So could you ever anticipate a loophole where this would actually cause somebody to be exempted?
Minister.
I can give my opinion on this, and then, of course, it's up to future governments and decision-makings in the policy. But as I mentioned before, the policy, like the reason for this legislation, what we've heard from the sector is that it needs to apply to the broadest, if not all, of the actors in the construction sector. We've seen that in other jurisdictions. I think I mentioned Alberta's initial legislation just applied to the private sector, and they're moving now to expand it to the public sector, because I think the general thought is it works better if more is included. And I think the member's right. If there ever was a decision by a cabinet or future cabinet through regulation that they would exempt, they would have to consider exactly, I think, what she's raising, which is will this run amok of the changes that we actually want to see, which is that all actors are acting in a way that moves payments through in an effective way. So I would imagine that would be at the forefront of the policy decision if that were to be made.
Shall Clause 4 pass? Aye. So ordered. On Clause 5, member.
Thank you. I don't have too much in this section. It's pretty straightforward. But I did want to clarify just in terms of alternative invoicing processes and milestone that don't fit into the 30-day kind of typical invoicing cycle. Would legislation and this act allow for, say, bad actors to write all of their contracts using, future milestones or different targets? So could bad actors who don't want to do a 30-day cycle essentially write all of their contracts to be, say, 45 or 60, so that they're holding on to their funds longer?
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. So this is a balance between the freedom of contract and the prompt payment regime. So maybe you could look at it as a balance, but you could also look at it as like the fact that contractors and owners are free to negotiate terms, and sometimes that, even that if you're not a bad actor, sometimes it includes milestone payments. Like if you do this thing, then I'll pay you this. And that's, part of the nature of the industry and the freedom that we want to give people to contract those terms. And, you could say that, an owner might try to negotiate that I want a 90-day timeline for my payment, but then they risk that that contractor wouldn't take the job because it's not frequent enough. So there's the leeway in there of that negotiation, and that's kind of a thing that we've seen in other jurisdictions too that put this place. But the key thing about it is once those have been negotiated and it's clear in the contract what the payment regime is, this prompt payment legislation will trigger very clear, once the proper invoice is given, very clear timelines on payment, right? So you can say that from the contractor, subcontractor's perspective, they can understand and design their businesses appropriately, right? Because under the contract, they understand their payments and they've signed on to whatever frequency of payments. And then they also know that if it doesn't hit that timeline that they've built into their business and that contract, that they can trigger very certain timelines so they can get that payment or dispute resolution quickly.
Member.
Knowing that there is possibility, and it is quite actually a common thing within the industry, that subcontractors don't know the contract of the person above them. So, if a contractor, say, has 60-day terms that they've negotiated with the owner, it's not necessarily known to the subcontractor that the contractor has 60 days. Is there any type of anticipation through regulation or policy that there's an alerting system or information that can be passed down to subs that they're taking on a contract with an owner who might have extended milestone type payment cycles, which will in effect also affect the subcontractor's payment cycles?
Minister.
Yes, we did consider that, and I'm happy to talk about it in section 12 once we get there.
Shall Clause 5 pass? Aye. So ordered. On Clause 6, member.
Clause 6 is one of the areas that I heard some concern, especially from larger contractors and larger projects. So if I look at, excavation of a project, in a 30-day cycle, you could have hundreds of thousands of dollars be on that progress draw for that month on that particular contract. So being off by a percentage or two in terms of their progress draw can result in a large amount of money being paid out ahead of time and that's why those checks and balances from banks are often required, or architects are often required, to make sure that if a subcontractor is saying, I've completed 8% of my contract this month, that they're billing appropriately those 8%. If the work was actually only 6.5% and they're billing for 8% without that certification process, in turn, the owner could be paying out, an extra 1.5% that monthly draw, which is on some of these larger contracts results in a large amount of money being paid out. So with that in mind, I was wondering how the Act ensures that improper, inaccurate invoices do not lead to overpayment or disputes.
Minister.
Yeah, thank you. So we know that this idea of like some kind of certification or payment certification or like some independent verification that the service or material that was meant to be delivered or that milestone is done to a certain standard is like an important part of the sector and will be used and we intend it to be used. So what this does is just ensure that it can't be used as a way to delay stuff. So what I'm saying, what it says is that you can't issue, you can't use it to prevent the issuance of a notice of, or, sorry, what am I saying? The payment, the proper invoice, that's the word I was looking for, the proper invoice. You can't use it to delay the proper invoice. So the way it would work maybe in reality is like, say you've issued your proper invoice on time, and a person can't say, well, I'm not going to receive it or trigger anything because I'm waiting for the certification. No, what has to happen is you can deliver the proper invoice. And of course, the person can still do any kind of verification they need to do, but it has to be done in a timely way then, right? Because the proper course of that would be, is for some reason that you've seen that it's not up to a standard, I don't want to pay because of whatever issue that this independent certification has said, then you can issue a notice of non-payment and then explain why, right? That non-payment hasn't happened. And what it's trying to remedy through this this provision is to make sure that that process isn't just used as a delay, right? To circumvent any prompt payment.
Recognizing the member from Kelowna Mission.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Nice to see you. Appreciate the explanation, and I think that what the Attorney General has just described is, from a real-world perspective, what has been described sounds quite reasonable. What I do have a little bit of concern around with regard to 6.1 is that that's not what I'm reading here. What I'm reading here is that a provision in a contract that makes the giving of a proper invoice conditional on the certification of a payment certifier or the approval of the owner is void. And what that would appear to do potentially is actually make it impossible for two consenting parties to enter into a contract that makes payment conditional on the certification by a payment certifier. And that's something that, you know, I would expect that might be something that two reasonable parties might want to enter into as an agreement. It would be quite normal for that to be an agreement in good faith and not be manipulated. So what I'm just a little bit unclear here about is that, again, the scenario outlined by the Attorney General is an abusive situation in which it's apparent that she believes it is the intent of stopping that. But if, for example, a contractor wishes to compete in a marketplace by offering to make payment contingent on the certification of a payment certifier, they are effectively prohibited from using that as a competitive tool in this situation. So again, I just want to understand whether the intent the Attorney General is describing is actually matched by the language in the legislation.
Minister.
I think this actually would help provide clarity to what I said. So certification approval can be a condition for payment, which is, I think, what the member was talking about, but not for the submission of a proper invoice. So there's a distinction there. So that's an important one. And I also will just note that we have to remember that in very complicated regimes or processes, you have many subcontractors that also might be reliant on that payment. So the making sure that things aren't delayed isn't just about the two parties, the owner and the contractor, it's also about all the other people in the chain.
Member.
Thank you, much appreciated. And that actually brings me very neatly to the next question here. So we were just discussing on this side what implications that could have around access to capital and to lending. Because typically you would see in situations where draws are dependent on the certification of work completed, there actually is also an additional party that is not in this chain of contracts whatsoever, and that is financing partners, whether those be financial institutions or others. So what consideration has been given to the implications of this particular section to lender behavior or to the relationship between owners, contractors, and lenders?
Minister.
Thank you. So these timelines and provisions are the same in other jurisdictions, including Ontario. And there's been when we dug into it, we had a whole roundtable that dug into how it was working in different provinces and what we could do to adapt it to BC. And there was no concerns raised about any lender behavior or anything. I just want to say that this legislation will require an adjustment because it's putting certainty of payment in the system. So that will require contracts to adjust and more consideration on the timeliness of things, which is the whole point of the bill. So yeah, we would expect that, and also to the member's point, a draw from a lending institution would be considered a payment. And since a draw from a lending institution is considered a payment, that you can put certification or approval as a condition for payment. That's not the issue. The question would be timeliness. So you issue your proper invoice, and then it triggers a timeliness, and you can have those conditions of payment, certification through that process. So it's just a matter of adjusting.
Member.
Thank you. I appreciate the fulsome answer. And just to confirm, what consultation has been undertaken with financial institutions and other lenders with regard to their understanding of the legislation?
Minister.
Yeah, thank you. I talked about the pretty extensive consultation that happened with the construction sector. So at that table, they brought their types of loans and types of lending that they undertake. in that industry. So they were our most important stakeholder when it came to that, and they didn't raise, actually, it was the opposite. They said they wanted this kind of certainty in their prompt payment to make sure that money would flow in a way that made it so they could meet their commitments, whether it's to the lender or to other institutions. And so, yeah, that was the type of consulting that we did.
Shall Clause 6 pass? Aye. So noted. On Clause 7, recognizing the member.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This may be a pedantic question, and I fully recognize that. However, I do just want to understand in 7.2, what exactly is the definition of giving a proper invoice? And again, I recognize that I am being pedantic with the question, but I do think it's important to understand when is a contractor deemed to have given an invoice, and what are the available mechanisms by which one can be formally given? Is an invoice given if it is emailed? Is it given if it is texted? Is it given if it is faxed? Is it given if it is handed in person? Is it given if it's mailed? If it's given if it's sent by carrier pigeon? Just want to understand, are there any specifics around what constitutes given as the trigger for the clock to start?
Minister.
It is a very good question, because that is how something is given is so key to what triggers a timeline. So I think it is a very important question, and I appreciate it. So the way that we've thought about it is that you will see under 49, when we get to that 49F, there is a regulation of making ability to clarify what the types of ways, maybe carrier pigeon, if that's what the industry says, but we will be talking to them about how we should define given, because it would be a kind of a pivotal moment in the prompt payment.
Recognizing the member from Langley Walnut Grove.
Thank you. Although I appreciate the intent with proper invoicing and what that means, my experience with a lot of smaller subcontractors, we're talking mom and pop shops, don't necessarily have a lot of administration to be able to handle the new requirements for what is deemed a proper invoice, especially on smaller projects, renovations, etc. And so I'm a little bit concerned with overburdening trades that have limited office capacity and resources. Could the Attorney General please clarify the type of timelines to come into compliance and ways that we can address the smaller contractors with this?
Minister.
Thank you. Yeah, so it's something that I appreciate is being raised because it is something we've thought about as well, and industry has talked to us about. So there's a few ways that we've addressed this. So the first one is, I would say, in the clause itself, what you'll see there is a list of things that are not overly complicated to do. So like it'll say the date of the invoice, the name of the contractor, the period of time. Those are things that some of them may likely be included in invoice or not, but it also is very clear what information is needed, because one of the things that I think came up in the discussions was sometimes we don't pay on time because we don't have enough information in the invoice and we have to go back and ask. So it also helps with that because it's clear what information is needed when you issue what's termed a proper invoice here. And then the other thing I think to be really will be really helpful is there's a lot of industry associations that are not only very keen about this prompt payment, but they're also very keen about educating people in the industry about these new standards if they're passed. So one of the things that I know that will be happening is there'll be like a standard form. So you could imagine that industry associations could produce, like, here's a standard form, proper invoice, so people that don't have the same level of administrative capability, it can be very clear that here's what you do to do a proper invoice. So those are the ways we've thought about it. And then the next part is, we know there's adjustment periods that are needed for the industry once this comes into force, if it does, and that would mean that we're delaying, and that's the time to get into implementation by regulation. So it'll be very clear that this is coming, and here's what the changes are, and here's the way you adapt. So those are the ways we thought about it.
Member.
Flipping gears to say a larger firm again, and when I think of, all the different layers that invoice verification happens, which goes all the way down really to boots on the ground, superintendents verifying work that has been done by their subcontractor, going to the project coordinator, then going to the project manager, then going to the accounting department, and then going to et cetera, et cetera. So if I look at it from that lens, having 7 days to correct an invoice is actually really, really tight. And I wanted to understand, if there's disputes over whether an invoice meets the proper requirement or the invoice requirements and be resolved quickly, how does that not impact the cash flow to subcontractors? I don't know if I worded that very properly, but if it's taking, up till day 6 to correct an invoice because it's had to go through so many layers, just even within the, a contractor, how is that not in effect also going to, that gives 1 day for a large company to then get their invoicing department or their accounting department to release a payment. And so I do see a little bit of issue and pushback in that regard, with larger firms having to go through their own internal layers to get invoice requirement verification in check.
Minister.
So just with respect to this, so first of all, I'll start by saying, we expect there will be an adjustment period. Like I said, and the member was talking about very sophisticated organization and the layers of approval or may not be necessary. They will have to adjust their work through these timelines, and I expect that they would be able to do so, especially since the industry's been asking us for this. But just that subsection 2 is related to, I'll just explain what would happen. So I've received a proper invoice, let's say, and I notice that it's actually not a proper invoice because it's missing some information. Well, then I can notify the entity to say that it doesn't meet the requirements of this, and then and what information is missing. And it just allows that ability for there to be any corrections in the proper invoice that are needed in order for there to be that trigger of payment. And then if we'll tie it to the next section. So then it says in the next section, one of two things can happen. The contractor can say, here's the missing information. And I agree that it doesn't change our initial timelines for prompt payment, this information. Or the contractor can issue another proper invoice, which is with the correct information, and then the timelines would be kind of like re-triggered at that point that's given to the owner.
Member.
Respectfully, that I would love every contractor to revise their invoice and subcontractor revise their invoices expediently. But the challenge that we have in the industry is that we are short trades and we are short workers. And it's already a challenge to get revised invoices, verification of work, even administratively. Me as a project manager, I'd call up the owner and be like, come on, this isn't actually the item that was supposed to be on this invoice. Let's correct it. Yeah. I'll get back to you. And 2 weeks later, I'm finally getting a revised invoice. The other piece that I do caution is that, yes, the industry has asked for these changes, but the industry encompasses a lot of different arms. And, you've got the lens of the trade and the subcontractors and the smaller firms. And then you've also got the contractors and the general contractors who build a project. But then you also have the lens of the developer who has to go through even more layers of protection on their project and their invoicing. And some of the concerns that we have is that, yes, this needs to happen, but we also have to add provisions for protections for the developers who are the ones shouldering the expenses of these projects and the ones that are going through the scrutiny with lending and lending requirements and making sure, that time is money and all costs on a project. Even, when I look at my experience on the ground, reaching my superintendent to verify a piece of information, be the end of the day when he finally gets to sit at his desk to be able to call me back and go, yeah, okay, this happened or this is not happening. And so I do just caution that throwing it out that the industry wants this is a fair statement, but it's also a fair statement to say that there is caution within segments of the construction industry that they have some red flags on how this will be executed in terms of the reality of making this happen.
Okay, Minister, I'm going to point.
Chair, I move that the committee rise and report progress and ask leave to sit again.
Members, you've heard the question. Those in favor indicate aye. Aye. Those opposed indicate nay. The motion is carried, and this committee stands adjourned for this day. Thank you so much for being here.